Yes, thank you. Yes, so my name is Andreas Zöttl. I'm from here, actually from Vienna, University of Vienna. And the topic today is, let's say, theoretical modeling and computational modeling. We will also do in the afternoon of passive and active particle dynamics in shear flows. And when I talk about theoretical modeling, it's very, let's say, the simplest possible theoretical model, I would say. And so I want to start with an overview. First, I will give a quick introduction about particle dynamics in flows. Then the first part will be about passive particle motion. And with particles, I mean microparticles usually, small particles, but not too small. Look at equations of motion and also stochastic dynamics. And then in the second part, we move to active particles in shear flows. So for example, when you have microorganisms, which move in external flows. And the third part, which is still also ongoing research a little bit, is about passive and active chiral particles, helical particles in shear flows, and what differs to the non-chiral particles. And I will talk about an experiment and some theoretical model for this, both for passive and active. So just a quick introduction about what this topic is about. So we mainly focus on microparticles in flows, in external flows. And this is, for example, important in our body, where we have, for example, the bloodstream. You have white blood cells, red blood cells, and all the other things which are in the bloodstream. And also, of course, you have flows in the ocean. For example, also a huge zoo of microorganisms, but also many other small passive particles, including, for example, microplastics, which is also now a big issue, big topic. And in this sense, looking at small particles moving in shear flow is also some sort of basis of rheology of soft materials, I would say. I will not talk about rheology at all, really. But really focus on some small scale which comes from the single particle motion. So here you can see some typical microplastics. These are micron-sized particles. Or here are many different microorganisms, and some of them are passive. They cannot swim, we say, and some are active, like these bacteria, which have this flagella, or ciliated organisms, algae with their cilia, or volvox, and so on. And rheology, often you deal with dense suspensions, but here I want to talk about really dilute suspensions, and extremely dilute, meaning that we only consider single particle motion. And it is often very important also, these very dilute situations. You can imagine, for example, in the ocean, it's huge, and you have many particles which do not have really collective motion, but individual motion. So one example is also, for example, when you have bacteria, which might be a bit more dense, and they enter capillaries. But this capillary, there is some flow subjected going in this direction. And then still bacteria can invade these vessels and swim against the flow, which is a purely single particle property. We will not discuss this specific system later, but related ones. And yes, what is somehow a basis for the theoretical modeling, I would say, is the hydrodynamics at low Reynolds number. So when we consider microparticles, they are small, and the fluid dynamics is typically given by low Reynolds number flow. We will also see later a little bit more how this looks like. And then, when we are at low Reynolds number, inertia does not play a role on the particle level. So we can deal with overdamped dynamics, this Aristotelian dynamics we've heard before. And inertia plays a negligible role for these small particles. But then you could say, okay, in the ocean, you have turbulent flows. Yeah, so why do we neglect inertia? We neglect it in this sense, as we say that the particle, even if it follows, let's say, a chaotic flow, locally, the dynamics is overdamped. Yeah? And inertia is not important for the particle motion. Of course, the background flow can be chaotic. So this is somehow the perspective. The first part is passive particles in shear flows. And we always have in mind small particles, yeah, like microparticles. And the idea is you have some flow field, Vf, which depends on the position r. And what is done very often is that you say, okay, locally, when you have a small particle, you can approximate the flow by a constant plus a linear flow plus higher order terms. Yeah? And this linear flow is often then called a linear shear flow. Yeah? So here is not the constant shown, but locally, when you have this particle, you have this linear velocity profile. Let's say the flow goes in one direction locally, yeah? And then the magnitude is changing. So the flow goes, let's say, in x direction. And in the z direction, the magnitude of the flow is changing. Yeah, this is what we call a linear shear flow. X is the flow direction, and z, we say sometimes it's the shear direction. Yes, so this is essentially what I said. So how can this linear shear be characterized, as I said, by these directions, and then also with the shear rate. Yeah, this shear rate essentially gives how fast the flow is increasing when increasing the z direction. Yeah, you can formally write it in this way, that the linear shear flow is a shear rate, gamma dot, times z, yeah, because it's increasing in z direction, and it is going in this x hat direction. So this is just the unit vector. Yeah. So gamma dot just gives the strength, the local strength of the shear. What is also important to note is that this shear rate, yeah, it has dimension of inverse time. Yeah. This you can easily see when you do the dimensional analysis, and this gives a certain time scale to a system, which is then also related to actually the rotation time scale of particles. So first we consider the non-Brownian case, meaning we have small particles, yeah, so they do not use inertia, but also thermal noise is not yet important. Yeah? This is typically the case, yeah, it depends on the specific shear rate, but let's say you have particles larger than 10 micron, then noise usually is not so important, but they're still small. Okay, so in general, what we have is when you put a particle in a flow, yeah, locally it looks like the linear shear flow, the particle translates with the flow, and it also rotates, yeah, and the translation is somehow clear, I would say. In the simplest approximation, you just say that the particle velocity, Vp, at a certain position r is exactly the flow velocity at this position r. Yeah, which just means that you can consider the small particle as a tracer particle, and it just goes with the flow, yeah, with the streamline. So we say it goes with the flow or it follows the streamlines. Yeah, this is what passive particles usually do. It's a bit more tricky to think about particle rotation. Yeah, I mean, when you put a particle there, or let's say you put it somewhere here, right? It will go here with this streamline, but also it will rotate, yeah, because of the shear. You can already imagine, right? So let's say a particle sitting here, it sees some velocity component to the right on its top and to its left on its bottom. Yeah. So you would expect that the particle will rotate in this direction. Yeah? So, and this is somehow the basics of rotation, right? You have some different velocities at different positions at the particle. Yeah. But this is a bit more tricky when you go to 3D. Yeah, in 2D you can simply see that. But also, okay, how strong is the rotation? Yeah, I mean, it should go somehow with the shear rate. Yeah, because the shear rate tells you how much more you go here to the right and here to the left compared to when you have a smaller gamma dot. Yeah, so the rotation should be related to the gamma dot. Okay, but now we see how exactly this is done. And okay, this looks a bit strange. Didn't look strange yesterday, as always. But okay, the thing is, so any flow field you can decompose into a so-called rotational part and an elongational part. Yeah. And for example, the simple shear, which looks very simple, it actually has both parts. A rotational part. Maybe I see if it looks a bit better later. Okay. And actually, sorry for the figure. Maybe it will become better soon. But the idea is, so the rotational part, yeah? So you can decouple this flow field. And the rotational part is essentially given by the curl of the flow field. Yeah? And this is also called the flow vorticity. And this is this omega f. That's the flow vorticity. And we can also interpret this as a pseudo vector, which goes, in this case, in the y direction, right? In the x, we have the flow. In the z, we have the shear. And in the y, we have the vorticity direction. Yeah? And then you can show that the rotational part of a particle, due to the flow vorticity, is just half the local vorticity of the flow at this position r. Yeah? You can also calculate this by solving the linearized Navier-Stokes equations. Yeah? But I think the solution is quite intuitive. And actually, for spherical particles, only the rotational part is important. But for ellipsoids and other, let's say, axisymmetric elongated particles, also the elongational part is important. And actually, what you see here is the elongational part. I don't know why this looks so strange. In this mode, you can see it nicer. So the rotational part is this, and the elongational one is this. Yeah, and I will not go back to the slide mode now, but you can calculate, for example, for the linear flow, the vorticity. You see, indeed, it goes in the y direction. And the prefactor is gamma dot. So gamma dot gives really the strength of the rotation, of the rotational part. And then there is also the elongation. And maybe I go now back to presentation mode. Okay. And the elongational part is essentially given by the strain rate of the flow, yeah, which is defined as the symmetrized part of the velocity gradient. Yeah, so this is a second rank tensor here. And then again, if you solve the linearized Navier-Stokes equations, you can see that not just for spherical particles, but also for elongated particles, you get for the rotation of the particle on top of this vorticity-induced rotation this extra term, which depends on the strain rate. And there is this prefactor G here. This is a geometric factor. We will see it on the next slide. This is related to the shape of the particle, essentially to the aspect ratio of elongated particles. And what is also important is that this elongational part, it also depends on, we call it later the particle orientation. Yeah? If you have a sphere, yeah, it doesn't have really a fixed orientation. Yeah? It is isotropic. And for a sphere, we only have this part. It's independent of how it is oriented. Yeah? But for elongated particles, we have this orientation. Yes, so this I said already before. We have the three kind of directions: flow, vorticity, and shear direction. Okay, once more, a bit more in detail. So when we look at an elongated particle, we can assign a director. Let's call it E. I mean, when you have a simple rod or ellipsoid, it's kind of a nematic object. Yeah, it's not entirely clear where you want to put the director, here or here. Yeah, but in this framework, you just choose one of the two. Yeah, and this is then a polar orientation vector. Yeah, and you want to understand later how the particle rotates, so how also the orientation vector changes over time. Yes, and we have now this factor G, and this is related to the aspect ratio of a particle. Yeah, when you have some length L and some width W, you get this aspect ratio. When you have elongated particles, the aspect ratio goes between 1 and infinity. Yeah? And you can show that for ellipsoids, this factor G, this shape factor, is just given by this formula. Yeah, it's the aspect ratio squared minus 1 divided by aspect ratio squared plus 1. And this is this G factor is also sometimes called the Brotherton shape factor. And for ellipsoids, it looks like that. Yeah, and you can see it here. As I said, the alpha can go from 1 to infinity, and then the G goes essentially from 0 to 1. Yeah, for spheres, G is 0. Yeah, so this part does not matter. And when you have thin needles, yeah, or particles with aspect ratio 5, 6 or so, then you are already in this regime where G goes even up to 1. Yeah. Okay. What is interesting is that this formula, yeah, even not for all particles, you can write it down analytically, the form of this shape factor. But actually, Brotherton showed that for any axisymmetric particle, you can define such a scalar, the shape factor. Yeah, not always you can calculate it analytically, but you can always use these equations of motion or this rotation rate, let's say, for an elongated particle rotating in flow. And yeah, when you go to, so this expression I wrote here is coordinate free, yeah, but when you go, of course, to a specific coordinate system, as we have seen before, you can just easily, for example, include the linear shear flow, and you can write down the rotation rate in Cartesian coordinates, yeah, and it's simple as that. Yeah, and there is always this prefactor gamma dot, which is the shear rate. It has dimension of inverse time, yeah, as this omega has. And you can also see when G is 0, there is no rotation in x direction, no rotation in z direction, and you only have rotation in y direction, which is gamma dot half. That is exactly the rotation rate of a sphere. But as I said before, it's more complicated when you have these elongated particles. Okay. Yeah, if you have questions, interrupt me anytime. Yeah. Here is just a small, somehow sketch. When you look in this velocity shear plane, when you put a sphere, yeah, and you can also, if you like, you can define a director of a sphere, right? You just mark a single point on a sphere and look how it evolves, and then you can also follow the orientation of the sphere. And of course, it doesn't matter where this orientation looks like, the omega, the rotation rate is always the same. But that's different for elongated particles. And this is essentially the visualization of this formula for elongated particles. It means that when you look against the flow or with the flow, yeah, the rotation rate is relatively small for this elongated particle. You can also see that when here the width is relatively small, you can see a very similar flow component on the top and at the bottom. But when you point perpendicular to the flow, yeah, it rotates very fast because it sees a very dramatic difference in the local velocity at the top and at the bottom. Yeah, so this is the simple kind of graphical solution, let's say, of this equation, at least in 2D. Okay. Yes.
So if you had a magic way to keep the particle center of mass fixed in a shear flow, you would expect a sort of oscillatory behavior.
Yes, we will come to that. Yeah. But even if you don't fix it, if you assume you're still in this linear shear regime, I mean, it doesn't matter if you're here or here or here, the gamma dot is everywhere the same. So this is also the case. You only have to consider the local gamma dot, which determines your rotation rate. Okay, so, but how does the director of the particle, yeah, which essentially gives the dynamics of the particle, changes over time? And this is a simple overdamped equation, yeah, for the change of the director E over time. It just goes with some angular velocity cross E. Yeah, this is just the standard motion, yeah, equation of motion overdamped for the director of a particle. Yeah, and it doesn't matter actually if this omega comes from a shear flow or from an electric field or whatever. Yeah, so this is a very basic equation. But in our case, we have this omega, we call it omega J, which is the Jeffrey orientation rate. Because Jeffrey, so he, 100 years ago, he was the first one who observed this dynamics and derived also these equations. So again, when we go to a particular coordinate system, we have this omega, and then you just insert it here, right? And you can easily write down the equations of motion for the director. So this dE over dt I write now as E dot, yeah, of all the three components. Yeah, and these are just simple coupled first order differential equations for the component E. And what is also important to note is that when we look at when we talk about the director E, this is always a unit vector, yeah? And when you do this operation, it automatically keeps the length of this unit vector constant, yeah? You just do a rotation, yeah? So when you, and we will do this in the afternoon, when we integrate these equations of motion, and you make your time step small enough, yeah, the orientation will be 1, yeah. But as we will see, this is a bit tricky, and in reality, you also have to normalize from time to time your orientation vector, because you always make some error in the integration numerically. Okay, but actually these equations you can even solve analytically And this was also done by Jeffrey. I mean, he didn't write it down in this kind of form, a bit more old school, but essentially what he showed is that when you solve these equations, depending on the initial orientation E0, you always get periodic motion, and where the oscillation amplitude is given by the initial condition. Yeah, and maybe before I discuss the constant of motion, I just show the solutions, typical solutions on the unit sphere. Yeah, sorry, I forgot to write down here the reference. But what you can see is this is the flow direction, here is the shear direction, and this is the vorticity direction. And then a particle always performs this kind of periodic motion, in this direction, on a unit sphere. Yeah, and these different curves correspond to different initial conditions. Yeah, and what does it mean? So when you have, for example, an elongated object, and let's say it's now perpendicular to the flow shear plane, so it's looking in the vorticity direction, it is just rotating, yeah, with and not changing. It's just rotating around its axis, yeah, but its orientation will stay the same. And this is the case C equals 0. It's also called log rolling motion. Yeah, but when you have, and this is given by this Jeffrey constant, C, given by the initial conditions, Ex, Ey, and Ez, and it depends on the aspect ratio alpha of the particle. Yeah, but when you go now to initial conditions where the Jeffrey constant is larger than 0, it means that you start somewhere off the vorticity direction, yeah, then your particle will rotate like this in the shear flow, yeah, and this is this typical Jeffrey rotation. Yeah, these are these periodic solutions, and depending on the initial conditions, you can have larger amplitudes or smaller ones. Yeah. Okay, and then the question is also, yes. Yes.
Could you go back to the expression for omega j, the one where you had the...
So to the previous slide?
Yeah, the previous slide. Yeah, so here, the expression for omega j, the part which is coming from non-sphericity,
yes,
you have E cross something, and then in your equation you have again E cross. So E cross is a projection along the...
Yes.
So essentially you're saying that dE dt, which is E cross omega j, and the non-spherical part is just a projection along E of ER, right?
Yes.
So it means it's only rotating along its axis due to the non-sphericity is only causing a rotation along the axis.
I mean, yeah, we will see it in a second when we write down. Oh no, we have written it down already. Here.
So the motion is just a rotation along the axis plus this rotation omega L, omega, the one coming from the flow.
No, but it's not just rotating around its axis. When you mean rotation around its axis, you mean this.
Yeah, but that's what I don't understand, because if I look at the equation here,
yes,
I have E cross something, and then you write dE dt is E cross omega j, and then I have E cross E cross. And if I do E cross, it's a projection along E.
Yes.
And that looks like a rotation only. All this is it's a projection along E. So this looks like a rotation only along the axis, and it looks like what you show is more complex.
But I'm not entirely sure, because this operation,
this is a vector.
This is a vector which is some direction, not along E, and then you do the cross product, which is perpendicular to this.
And then if you take another cross twice the cross product is a projection. So
1 minus u. So you're still allowed to do this, but you're not allowed to change the length.
yes.
But you're allowed to do this.
Oh, you're right. It's 1 minus the projection.
1
so
minus
the other one.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So yeah, it's doing some non-trivial, and you see it.
It's a projection in the
Yeah.
You also, yeah. Yes. So also this, what I'm showing, yeah, this is used in many works, right? Jeffrey rotation, but I decided to discuss it here a bit more detailed because people always assume that you just rotate, you use the equations, but I think it's always good to see where it comes from. Okay. I just wanted to say that, right, you can show that it is periodic motion, and then you wonder, right, what is the periodicity of this motion? And you can show that the frequency or the angular frequency of this motion is, of course, just given by the shear rate. It's linear with the shear rate. Yeah, the larger the shear rate, the faster you rotate. And then it depends on the aspect ratio alpha of the particle. Yeah. But it does not depend on the initial condition or on the Jeffrey constant, yeah? Which means that all oscillations, yeah, they go with the same frequency, yeah? No matter if you have a small amplitude or a large amplitude, yeah? This you can also show. Only, yeah, the dramatic effect is when you increase alpha, the rotation frequency goes down a lot, yeah, very fast when you go to these relatively needle-like particles. It just means that when they align with the flow during the rotation, they go very fast, right? And this slows them down significantly. Okay? Yeah.
Gradient of velocity of the flow is 0.
If the
In some point, in one point.
yes, let's see the shear rate.
Okay. But in that point, we have a rotation.
Okay, that's the thing is you can always have contributions from higher order. Yeah. So in principle, you can have some small rotation. Yeah. In the case when you say, okay, the particle size is not negligible to some curvature of the flow, let's say, or something like that. So if it's not point-like anymore, yeah, there are some contributions, yeah. But they are very small. You cannot see it here. And I also have to say, right, I mean, in reality, you don't have just linear shear. You have more complicated ones. And we have also done a couple of numerical simulations and boundary element simulations and so on. But what you can see, for example, when you have quadratic flow and so on, locally, I mean, the rotation rate can very well still be approximated quite well with just looking at the shear rate, the local shear rate. And higher orders only play a very small role. It's a bit surprising, but yeah. So, and this is why this equation is so successful. I mean, you could say, right, I mean, linear shear flow is very specific. But you can say, right, even if it's not linear, but you calculate locally some shear rate, then the particle will, to a very good approximation, rotate due to, yeah, these equations. Right. And now, so far we looked at the Cartesian coordinates of a particle. But of course, you know, when you have a polar vector, you can instead also have a description of two angles, yeah, because each director E can be written in terms of two angles. let's say, psi and theta. And sorry, here I've shown a little bit more complex particle, which I will talk about later. It's not just an ellipsoid, but here we have the correct coordinate system. So you can just define some angles, psi and theta, as you like. Yeah? I did it in this way, that psi is the angle in the xy plane, so in the vorticity flow plane, because this is often a plane which can be visualized experimentally. And theta is then the out-of-plane angle. Yeah, and then this is the director of the particle written in terms of the angles. Oh, come on. And then, oops, you can rewrite the equations of motions for the three components, Ex, Ey, and Ez, just in terms of the angles, psi and theta. Yeah, then you get an equation psi dot and theta dot. Yeah, and actually this is also a form where you can really solve them, decouple them, and find an equation of motion and so on. Yeah. Okay. And the thing is, why it's nice to write it in these angles, because you can often very easily draw then trajectories in this psi theta phase space. Yeah, I mean, this is just a unit sphere, of course, but you can draw it on a map. And the Jeffrey orbits, yeah, which are these periodic solutions, are just closed, directed, let's say, curves in this phase space. Directed because you just go along a specific direction here, right, on the unit sphere. These are the same trajectories I've shown before, essentially. Yeah, these are these black lines. Yeah, depending on the initial condition, you have these orientations. The thing is now, what is also very important to notice that when you have a rod, yeah, and then, as I said, it's somehow you can make a polar director here or here. It's the same. And this is also reflected by this phase space. So if you, let's say, mark the dot of the orientation here, and then you start somewhere, you will do such a trajectory. If you mark it here, yeah, you are on the negative, or now on the positive psi, and then you go here. Yeah, it just depends if you mark it here or here. So this is very symmetric. It has to be, yeah, when it's a rod. What is also shown here on this graph is these colors, yeah? And these colors just tell you the probability density function to find a particle at a specific orientation. Yeah, and what you see is, so this is here for an elongated particle. What you see is that, and here is no noise, but you see some noise because here I just integrated the equations of motion of many of them at random initial condition. Yeah, I mean, you could also solve the Fokker-Planck equation if you like. Yeah, that's equivalent and maybe more cleaner plot. But when you do this deterministic equations of motion, and then you just measure at how many times you find a particle in a certain bin here, you see that there is this peak at psi equals 0 and theta equals 0, or at pi, which means that there is a high probability to find the particle aligned with the flow lines. Yeah, and this is simply related to the fact, as we said, that a particle rotates slower, yeah, when it's more oriented, more parallel to the flow. Yeah, and it rotates faster when it's perpendicular to it. And so if you follow here a simple orientation, let's say trajectory in orientation space, it goes fast here, then it slows down here, it goes fast here, slow down here, and so on. Yeah, this is this typical kind of Jeffrey tumbling solution. And this is why you get these peaks. Yeah, and this is often very important when you do rheology, I guess, of elongated particles, that even if you have interactions, right, you see this tendency of particles to be oriented with the flow. Of course, it's more complicated when you have a denser suspension, but that's somehow the origin on the single particle level. Good. Half of the time is over, so I will be now a bit more faster. Yeah, but I thought it would be good to introduce this problem a bit slower because it's a very fundamental one. And this is the essential, so the equations I showed, this is the basis also to make the system active, yeah, to include other flows and so on. So because, as I said, often flows are more complex. When you have microchannel flows, for example, you have this quadratic profile, yeah? So you have some inlet and outlet flow, and for example, when this channel is much wider than higher, then you have essentially, away from the sidewalls, a planar Poiseuille flow, yeah? And the thing is, as I said before, if you put now a small particle somewhere here, yeah, it still rotates with the same equations of motion with a rotation rate which is related to the shear rate the particle has at its center position, yeah, at its center of friction. So even if you have a quadratic profile, yeah, you can calculate the local here z-dependent shear rate, which changes linear with z. Yeah, so in the center there is no shear, at the wall is the highest shear, and at the center the ellipsoid will not rotate, but closer to the walls it would rotate much faster. Yeah. Yes, what is also of course important is that when you go from the bottom half to the top half, also the sense of rotation changes because let's say the sign of the shear changes. Yeah, so here you rotate in this direction and here in the other one. Okay, and yeah, so there is one experimental realization also with small rods. We will see how this is done. But before that, I also want to talk about noise now, yeah, because we have now looked at the deterministic equations, and very often, yeah, you have not just 10 or 100 micrometer particles, but 1 micron, for example, yeah, and then noise, in particular rotational noise, becomes very important, and then you have to adapt your equations of motion of your vector. Yeah, we are still, yes.
I mean, maybe a very stupid question.
No.
So the description that you gave us so far.
Yes.
Can it be applied to in a channel? Like an elongated board in a channel at this level?
If it's small enough, and if it's axisymmetric, yes.
So in principle,
yes,
before introducing stochasticity, if I am in a laminar flow
yes,
with a small canoe, the canoe would point at the center of the canal,
yeah,
and then this would be a stable point for the canoe. Or no?
No, not in linear shear. I mean, there are, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there are flows where, so in the linear shear flow, the rotational part and the elongational part, they cancel it.
In the Poiseuille flow?
Even there, it will always rotate. There is no stable orientation in the overdamped case.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this result about the preferential orientation, is it influenced to a leading order by the motion in the Poiseuille flow or no?
Yes. So yeah, this is not different because yeah, in the linear shear flow, it doesn't matter where you are. You always have the same shear rate, and this is exactly in the Poiseuille flow it is. So if you look at different layers in a Poiseuille flow, you will see in the center of the channel is more or less a flat distribution of orientation. But when you go closer to the walls, you see these peaks more and more. Yeah. Okay. But now let's go to noise. Yeah. So typically the standard way to include noise for axisymmetric particles is to consider the so-called rotational diffusion of a particle. Yeah. So we know, of course, when we consider the translational motion, yeah, there is some noise due to the interaction with the environment, with the fluid particles, but also there is rotational noise. Yeah, so it gets kicked around yeah, and there is some noise due to its small size. And this is the rotational diffusion constant. And maybe, because I don't have it on the slide, I just want to write it down how this dr looks for a sphere. Yeah, because just that you see how sensitive this is on the size. Yeah, this dr is essentially given by the Stokes-Einstein relation. It's kBt divided by the rotational friction gamma r. And this is for a sphere, for example, this gamma r is given by 8 pi, the radius of the sphere cubed times the viscosity of the fluid, eta, let's say. So you see, even for a sphere, this is very sensitive to size. And this really means that if you go above 10 micron, very fast you don't see any rotational noise. Yeah? If you go below 10 micron, let's see 1 micron, you see a dramatic effect of noise. Yeah? So this rotational noise is very size sensitive. Okay. And yeah, you can show that you can just add it in the equations of motion by adding the square root of 2 times the rotational diffusion constant times psi r. This is a Gaussian white noise vector. So these are three numbers, which gives in each direction x, y, z a random number, a Gaussian random number with 0 mean and unity standard deviation. So you can imagine this competes with the deterministic part. Yeah. So, okay, I hope you can see that, because this you may also need in the afternoon, how you integrate stochastic differential equations. I mean, there are books about this topic, yeah. But we just do a simple, let's say, Euler integration, saying that the director E at time t plus delta t is just E of t plus a delta E. And okay, in 3D, how you calculate this delta E now? It consists of 3 terms essentially. The first one is just the deterministic rotation. Yeah, the delta E is omega cross E times delta t. And this is how you just do simple Euler integration. And then maybe many of you know how you integrate the stochastic term. I will not go into the details. I still want to talk about active particles. So let's see. The thing is, if you integrate it, it depends now on the square root of delta t. Yeah, you get a factor square root of delta t, and this considered the stochastic rotation. Yeah, because you have to integrate over a stochastic process, and then you get this delta, square root of delta t. And yeah, and there is just a technical note. There is also another small extra term, which is a drift term due to multiplicative noise, because here you multiply the noise with the director, and then you get this extra drift term. Yeah, yeah.
For elongated particle.
This is also for an elongated particle. Yeah. So because this equation does not matter if it's spherical or not.
Oh, it does, because dr depends on E now.
No, I mean, okay. So in principle, yes. In principle, dr is a tensor. Yeah. If it's not a sphere, it's a tensor. But if it's an axisymmetric particle, we do not consider rotational diffusion about this axis, because this is not changing the director, and it's the same in both the other directions. So there's just a single dr value, even for a rod. Yeah? It's different when you have 3 axial particles. Then you have a full tensor. Yeah. And then you look in the literature, and you will find out it's not so easy to find nice simple equations for that anymore. That's a different story. Okay, and then what you see is when you now integrate these equations of motion and you again, for example, plot the probability density function, and now I keep the rotational diffusion constant, but I change the shear rate, okay? And then this, when I increase the shear rate, this deterministic part becomes more and more important and this less and less important. So when I'm at very high shear rate, then the probability density function looks the same as without noise, yeah? But when I go down, 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 noise becomes more and more important, yeah? And there is more and more stochastic reorientation, then these peaks flatten out more and more. Also, there is a nice effect that it breaks this kind of symmetry in data, but I don't have time to talk about this.
Noise, then I would expect these trajectories are not perfect ellipses.
Exactly. So they are not ellipses anymore, and they are so-called stochastic Jeffrey orbits, and I will quickly say something about this as well. I just want to mention something which is very important. It's a Pechle number which determines how the probability density function looks like. And this Pechle number is just the ratio of the shear rate with the rotation diffusion constant. That they have both the same physical dimension, so this is a dimensionless number. I don't want to talk about the alternative definition here. I just want to say, right, if you do 2D dynamics, the integration is much simpler. Yeah? Then you only have a single angle phi, and when you integrate, you know, you don't have this drift term due to the multiplicative noise. Yeah. Okay. Good. Then I just want to show you one example of small noise, small particles where noise is important. And this was done some years ago in collaboration with Dirk Arts and Julia. Small micro rods in channel flow. So silica rods. They are also a bit heavy, yeah, so they sediment and then they rotate. But what we found was that due to the fact that they are only 3-4 micron in length, you do not see at all this Jeffrey dynamics. Yeah, they are very noisy. And yeah, you can do some comparison. I just want to focus here on one aspect. And this is one concept we introduced, how you can characterize the noise impact on the trajectories. And this I call the so-called Jeffrey orbit persistence. Yeah, so if you have no noise, you know, you go on one of these trajectories. And the Jeffrey constant is really a constant. Yeah, it stays the same over the whole duration of the trajectory. Yeah, and you can measure this Ex, Ey, and Ez at each instant in time, and it will be a constant. Okay, the thing is now, when you have noise, you do not have this perfect periodic solutions anymore. But you can still calculate C at each time step. But this C will now change over time. Yeah? So when you have noise, C will increase or decrease, right? And how fast this change somehow determines how fast you go away from your initial Jeffrey orbit state. Yeah. So what we did was first, because the Jeffrey orbit constant, it goes from -infinity to +infinity, you can do a bijective transformation from C to C prime, which is then between -1 and +1. Yeah. And then I do not want to talk about this too much. I just want to say, so you can measure the probability. Yeah, when you measure many rods in experiments and in simulations, you can determine the probability density function to be in a certain Jeffrey orbit state, C prime. Yeah, and then you get this kind of distribution. We do not have a theoretical idea why we get this. Yeah, probably one has to go to the Fokker-Planck equation. But what is interesting is you can measure now the Jeffrey orbit, so the autocorrelation function of your Jeffrey orbit state over time. Yeah. So this is actually the C prime t correlated with C prime at time 0. And you see that there is an exponential decay at a certain time scale, meaning there is a certain time where you lose information about your initial Jeffrey orbit state. Yeah.
C prime equals 0 is implied. Is that correct?
C prime equals 0. Yeah, good question. It is, but I think, yeah, I don't know. Yeah. At least it's a bijective transformation. I don't know now if the -1 corresponds to -infinity. It should be because of the sign, and 0 should be 0. Yeah.
Is heavier than the pole. But then you have depletion in the middle. Do you have some idea why do you have that?
Yes, no, that's a good point. And yeah. So I also don't remember how this distribution looks like when you draw the distribution of C and not C prime. Yeah. Yes.
Need or jump around all of them?
It will jump around. It will jump around in principle. So you have, when you think your director is somewhere in the unit sphere, and you can just jump around where you like. It will just be, it will not reach some stable orbit, let's say. It's a stochastic reorientation. So I skipped this, but here you see typical trajectories, experimental and from simulation, of the director over time. It is more like really random motion, not random, yeah, because on top is the Jeffrey, but it looks random like on the unit sphere. The stochastic process, yeah. Okay, and one more thing, and this is also something we did not so far understood from the simulations, but maybe from a theory, I don't know, in the future. The thing is, when you have this decay, yeah, this typical decay of your Jeffrey orbit state, this is not just the time, it's not the same time scale as the rotational diffusion, yeah, because due to this tau r, the inverse of this is related to a time scale, the rotational diffusion time scale, but that's not the same. It is only the same in the limit of vanishing shear rate. But then, when you increase the shear rate, it's not the same as the rotational diffusion time. So this is just maybe a motivation if somebody wants to do a theory on that. I think it's still open. Okay. Yeah.
It's like the stretching of the orbits?
Yeah, but also because you're in a unit sphere, it's some curved manifold. And I think there is some subtle issue how you move in a unit sphere. Yeah, because, yeah, I don't know. We can discuss. But I still want to show some active particles, okay? Okay, because the main, and here I will be a bit faster, because I also want to show you some chiral particles. But yeah, as I said, many organisms, they move in flows, and there are also now different setups to study this experimentally. And I don't have to tell you much about different microswimmers. I think I can skip that. But many organisms, they can just swim. Yeah, they are active. And as I said, then you can go from the Navier-Stokes equations to the Stokes equation to solve problems. Yeah, I will skip this. And I want to to go now to the basic equation of an active particle in flow, because it looks very similar to the Jeffrey equation. So if you have an active particles, like a microswimmer, it will move at a certain velocity v0 along its director, okay? This also means it can easily cross streamlines now, yeah, in contrast to the passive particle. But actually, what we know now is that the rotation rate, yeah, of the active particle is the same essentially as for the passive particle. Yeah, you don't have to change anything. It's just a matter of shape how you rotate. Yeah, and this is why you only include, when you change the equations of motion, you now have coupled equations of orientation and position. Yeah, it goes with the flow plus we have this activity term. It goes with velocity v0 along its director e. But now you see they are really coupled. Yeah, so I mean, this is still in the, yeah, they're coupled in general. They're both coupled. Yes, so this is the same equations we had before. And actually, so Jeffrey derived these equations, you know, for passive particles. And then there was this early works, let's see, relatively early from Pedley and Kessler and so on, who really used these equations for the active particles for microorganisms. Yes, I just want to say, in 2D, for example, when you put, for simplicity, just a 2D, let's say a quadratic flow, yeah, and you put an active particle here, it can cross the streamlines. Yeah, it will still rotate in this direction here and in this direction here. But there is now a coupling. Yeah, and when you look at the equations and you look now at the dynamics, yeah, the swimmer is always going along its director, plus it is carried with the flow. And what you see are these kind of swinging and tumbling solutions. Yeah, so this is when you solve these equations. So this is a numerical solution, but you can really easily show that this is just the pendulum equation, essentially. And when you look at the phase space of orientation and position, when you start somewhere inside here, you get oscillations, and here you get tumbling. Yeah, this is like when you have a pendulum, you get oscillations to a certain frequency, and when you stop outside, you have this turning over solution of your pendulum. Yeah, these are the tumbling solutions. And these are the basic kind of solutions in 2D. Yeah, so a swimmer is doing periodic swinging or tumbling, depending on the initial conditions and the flow geometry and the speed of the swimmer. Yeah. And this you can solve analytically for a sphere, but also for an ellipsoid. And then this red curve is just the separatrix between these two different groups of solutions here. Yeah, and the nice thing is you can also see this in experiments. For example, with this striponosome, when you put it and it's live, it is really doing this kind of swinging motion, and you can match it with the theory, somehow also the frequency of its motion. So this very simple model is quite good. And later, it was also confirmed, although it's a bit noisy when you do it with bacteria, but you can really do also trajectories of bacteria and compare it with the model. Yeah, the noise is a bit big, but you can really see that this model is good for bacteria. Okay, this I will skip maybe when you do, no, not skip, but let's say you have now a 3D motion of the swimmer. Then you need two angles to describe the director. And then maybe the position of the channel is just the radial coordinate. Due to the symmetry, the phi coordinate and the z does not play a role. Yeah, so you get the state vector is now three-dimensional. Okay, and you get coupled equations for the three state variables. And then you can also show that there are two constants of motion, and then in the 3D phase space, they are divided again by the separatrix. And you get this kind of very complex swinging and tumbling trajectories, for example, in a circular pipe, but also in a planar flow. you get these kind of trajectories. But this is just, this is just for fun. You can even go now, and this is now very funny just because the solutions look funny. When you go to a channel with elliptic cross sections, here the math is a bit more complicated. You need some kind of stretched, how do you call it? Stretched polar coordinates, and write down your equations of motion. Yeah, there are 4 now. Yeah, so you lose the cylindrical symmetry. You have a 4-dimensional system. But still, I don't know, after looking for more than 1 year, I was able to find a constant of motion in the system, which reduces this again to a 3D dynamical system. And this I just want to show you for fun, because you get now not just periodic, but also quasi-periodic and chaotic solutions for the swimmer dynamics. Yeah, so x dot, this is the 4-dimensional state vector, is this function f, which I've not written down. I mean, it's essentially this, which depends on the system parameters and the constant of motion. And what you can analyze now, yeah, we have reduced, because we have one constant of motion, we can reduce this 4D system to an effective 3D system. And then you can, in 3D, what you can do is a so-called Poincare map. So you look at 3D trajectories in the 3D phase space, and then you only consider points which go through a particular plane in phase space. Yeah, and then you can somehow show how the quality of the trajectories looks like in a 2D plane. Yeah, when you have a periodic motion, you just get a single point in a Poincare map. When you get a so-called quasi-periodic motion, you will get points which will go through this plane, which will be a closed kind of loop. Yeah? So this is really the Poincare section here. And when it's chaotic, yeah, it goes through this plane very irregularly. Yeah? And then you can, you fix the parameters and you just change the initial conditions of the swimmer. And then what you get are these kind of nice Poincare maps of this swimmer. I don't want to go into detail, but you can really see that these black areas and lines, these are really just dots. Just dots you measure while going through a specific plane in phase space. Okay. And then you get periodic motion, quasi-periodic motion, for example, order 6 quasi-periodic motion in the channel, and no, this was periodic still, this is quasi-periodic, and chaotic motion. Yeah, depending where you start in the phase space. Okay, but this is just for fun, I would say. I think in experiment you could never see this because noise will destroy this. Okay, but then this I will skip. Because I still want to talk now about helical particles or chiral particles. Yeah, because so far we have only considered particles which are axisymmetric, and many particles in biology, but also now we have these microprinted helical particles. They are chiral, yeah, and they somehow break the axisymmetry. So they are not axisymmetric anymore. And there was also this, for example, this paper from the Stocker group who showed that if you take these helically shaped bacteria and you put them in flow, they will drift in the vorticity direction or in the negative vorticity direction, yeah, depending on if they are in the top or bottom of the channel. Yeah, and this drift, yeah, this left-right symmetry breaking, it cannot occur when you look at an ensemble of particles when you have non-chiral particles. Yeah, but due to chirality, you can break the symmetry. And this was also known for passive particles, but also for active ones. There's again a very nice paper from the Stocker group who showed that also actively, so they are passive here, yeah, but active swimming bacteria, they go in a specific direction, in the vorticity direction. And it's interesting because the active ones go in the opposite direction to the passive ones. And the contribution we did on a theoretical level on this was, so there was already some work and some numerical work and solutions, but it's not entirely clear, yeah, when you put a chiral particle in shear flow, depending on its orientation, how this will change its orientation. Because what is known here, although they drift, yeah, it's an effect of how they change their position. This is coupled to their orientation. Yeah? So there is an orientation effect which is responsible for this. So in Paris, Anke Lindner's group, what they did was they created these microprinted particles, a sphere plus a helix attached, yeah, to mimic somehow dead bacteria. And you can control very well the shape of this kind of flagella, let's say. Yeah, you can change the pitch. This is essentially what you do. You can change the chirality from left-handed to right-handed, and so on. And what you see is, for example, when you now put them in a flow, yeah, you can see they do these kinds of Jeffrey-like oscillations, but you will see that after some time, they will switch from pointing their head to the left side to the right side and the other way around. I don't know if you noticed that. You can quantify it here. If you look at the oscillation of the in-plane angle psi, yeah, and you have a left-handed particle, it will increase its amplitude, and then it will flip somehow from the negative psi to the positive psi. Yeah, so the head points to the negative, and then at a certain point to the positive. This is obviously not possible for passive axisymmetric particles. Yes, and on the other hand, yeah, all the thing is reversed when you have a plus for right-handed particle. Yeah. But the thing is, when you start, for example, let's consider the left-handed. If you start relatively close to minus pi half, then it will not increase the amplitude, but it will decrease. Yeah? And when you start with a positive psi, it will also decrease and not go to the other side. Yeah? And this effect somehow we understood by a theoretical model. Maybe I quickly want to go there. So the idea is the following. You have a particle which has some head plus a helix attached, rigidly attached. And as it was already in these Stocker papers known, that when you put a helix in shear flow, it will drift towards the negative z direction. And you can explain this qualitatively by, for example, applying resistive force theory on the helix in shear flow. And the idea is, okay, I try to explain it quickly. So all the upper parts of the helix, let's say they assume a positive velocity in y direction, and the black parts are at the bottom, they get a negative one. So black and red, so this is now a top view. So they have opposite velocities. And there is this resistive force theory which relates local forces on a slender object to the velocities of this object. And when you integrate this now and add this up, you will see that these contributions from the top and bottom part, there is some net vector in the minus z direction. Yeah? So you can see from resistive force theory that the helical particle has some drift. And when you change the chirality from left-handed to right-handed, it will go in the different direction. Okay? But what we did was then do a more formal analysis of putting the helix in any direction, psi and theta in shear flow, and calculate the drift velocity of a helix. Yeah? And now the thing is, when you attach the helix to a body, and this was also already recognized in this paper from the Stocker group, the helix wants to go in a certain direction, yeah? But the head is non-chiral, so this induces a chirality-induced torque and an effective so-called rheotactic velocity of a chiral bacterium in a specific direction. Yeah? And we know that elongated particles, like bacteria, they have a higher probability to be aligned with the flow. Yeah? So they have this configuration where they're more or less aligned, and the lift goes in this direction, and then there is this reorientation, and the bacterium goes in the opposite direction as the passive helix would like to go. Yes? Yes, this is dead, but the reorientation dynamics is the same for passive and active. Here we just looked at the rotational dynamics. This is really the same. Only you have to consider, so this picture, this also holds, this chirality-induced torque is also there for passive ones. Yeah? But what you don't have for passive ones is that they cross the streamlines. Yeah? They don't have this rheotactic velocity. This is only for the active ones. Okay? Yes, so, and this was what we did. So we calculated when you put the helix in shear flow, how will it drift depending on the angles. There is this prefactor gamma dot. So again, this chirality-induced drift depends also on the strength of the shear rate. And then there is another prefactor. Here it is written as K1. And this depends on really the shape of the helix. Yeah. So I also have some unpublished work how the formula looks like for K1. This is still work in progress, but you can calculate it depending on resistive force theory how this looks like. Yeah, it depends on the pitch of the helix and so on, the length of the helix and the radius, and some end effects. And then the thing is, you just calculate then the chirality-induced torque. So E is now the director of your particle, passive or active. And V is here now this chirality-induced velocity. And then there is another prefactor K2, which depends on the shape of both helix and head. And then you can calculate really this chirality-induced torque depending on the orientation of your chiral particle. And the nice thing is, right, I mean, we have Aristotelian mechanics. You can show that you can just simply add now two effects. We have, when we look at the dynamics of the particle orientation for psi and theta, this is the Jeffrey term. Yeah, we have seen before, linear in gamma dot, and depending on the shape and its orientation. And now we have a second term, which is this chirality-induced reorientation term, which also depends linearly on the shear rate, then on the handedness, so that's either +1 or -1, and on this nu, which is, as we said, the chiral strength of the particle. Yeah, this is a dimensionless number. If it is 0, it's a non-chiral particle. And for chiral particle, this is typically the order of 10 to the power of -2 or a bit larger. Yeah, but this effect is always smaller than the Jeffrey effect. But still, you can see it when you have non-Brownian particles, right? As we have seen, because Jeffrey is just doing periodic motion. Yeah, and when you have now this extra term which breaks the left-right symmetry, yeah, you can really see how you go now to a stable orientation. Just for technical reasons, I want to mention that there is another term for the experimental system. Here, the head is a bit heavier than the helix, so there is also another head-heavy orientation torque. But that's not so important now for the discussion. And the thing is, you can now measure all so we know from experiments plus from boundary element method simulation all the parameters in our system, and we can now plot on top of the experimental oscillations the theoretical ones, which are the black curves, and they fit perfect, a bit too perfect, because the only thing which I did here, I cheated, was I set the frequency exactly as the frequency from the experiments. Because in the experiments, we only know the shear rate up to some 5% error. And within this error, this 5%, I was setting in the simulations the shear rate that we get exactly the same frequency as in the experiments. But this simple model, yeah, it really, depending on the initial condition, it really shows that it's working well for these chiral particles, yeah, for these nicely constructed microprinted particles. Yes, and as I said, there was a third term due to gravity. And actually, but the gravity is somehow doing something here. But what I want to focus on is that, so when we had this orientation phase space for the axisymmetric one, here and here it looked the same. But now there is, there is this left-right symmetry breaking. If you oscillate somewhere here, right, you can flip to the other side. It's exactly this process here. But this is, we call it the asymmetric bistability because, so here is a stable point or a marginally stable fixed point essentially. And here is another fixed point, which comes from the gravity, yeah. So if you start sufficiently close to here, then you will go to this fixed point. But I don't have time to talk about these details here. But I hope you're convinced that this simple modeling, yeah, and we will use also these kind of simple equations in the afternoon to study dynamics of passive and active particle in simple shear flows. Yes, decay rates. I just want to mention at the very end, right? I mean, you can have a nice comparison with these passive particles, microprinted, but yeah, it's a bit more tricky when you compare to really bacteria. Yeah, there you have to include the noise, but okay, we'll skip this. So there were this work already from Stocker group I showed you before. What I want to show you is now another experimental setup from Anke Lindner's group and Eric Clément's group in Paris, where they now measured in many different layers in the pulsar flow the distribution of velocities in the vorticity direction and also of orientations of bacteria. They did this SET scan and measured the so-called rheotactic velocity. Yeah, that's the velocity in the vorticity direction, which is 0. You can see here for passive beads. And for chiral bacteria, yeah, you can measure it. When you go more and more to the wall, you have a higher shear rate and a higher rheotactic velocity. And you can actually you can plot it as a function of the local shear rate in the channel, and you can see that this fits well to a single curve. The thing is now, with our simple model, and we add now rotational noise, we can, so in the experiments, they did very nice data measuring the distributions of velocities and orientations of bacteria. And we compared it with the numerical results from the simple model, and we get a very nice quantitative agreement, even for these very noisy bacteria in the shear flow. Okay, yes, and the model, right? You see everything starts from Jeffrey, and then you just add up more terms. I mean, this is what we do. I mean, it takes sometimes some years to find out which terms and how you arrive at them, but this is essentially what we do, right? And here you have now the Jeffrey term, the chirality-induced term, and the noise, right? Here you have the activity and the flow and maybe some translational noise if you like, right? And then you can really do very simple simulations and just add all the things up, yeah? And good. And I think this is the final plot I want to show. Once more, these probability density functions, okay? Now we compare a non-chiral particle with a chiral one, yeah? And this we have seen before, the non-chiral one, we have this, they tend to be oriented with the flow, yeah? A bit less with the flow when the flow becomes weaker, yeah, because noise is stronger, it flattens out more. Now we compare it to the chiral ones, yeah. So they, because there is now this, actually it's a marginally stable fixed point on one side, they really want to go there, yeah. When you have very strong shear rate, you can neglect the noise, and then you get a nice peak pointing now in the vorticity direction, yeah, which gives you this rheotactic velocity. But when you go down with the shear rate, there is a competition now, yeah? So you can just jump around in this space due to noise, and then this single peak will go to a double peak, and eventually you will be back in the case where you don't see the chirality anymore, yeah, a very low shear rate. Right? And this all fits very nicely together. Good, and this is so far the current state we have. We will now also do, I mean, my collaborators do new simulations also in different fluids, like non-axisymmetric flows, or also in more complex fluids. This is still ongoing work. But I hope I could convince you that by looking at this very fundamental, let's say, dynamics of passive and active particles, we can write down relatively simple equations, can solve them, and understand some physics with that. And finally, yeah, I don't have a summary. I just want to give some acknowledgements to the collaborators, in particular in Paris, who did many of the experiments with the passive and active particles, and some of them also in China, in Xi'an, Northwestern University. Daiki Matsunaga, so he did the boundary element method simulations for the microprinted particles. And with Arnold Matthijssen, we first developed this chirality-induced torque term experiments from the arts group. And Holger Stark, I did my PhD where I started to look at this simple microswimmer dynamics. All right. Yes, I think time is over, and yeah, we can discuss more later, also in the afternoon, and I want to thank you for your attention.